Thank you, Christian. Yes, my name is Martin Forsberg. I will take you through some of the eDelivery aspects and compare a bit about how EDI and electronic invoicing or integration projects have been architected in the history, and how eDelivery can address some of the challenges that we have seen before. So I will, let's see here. I will start with a short introduction to some of the challenges in electronic business. We will look at different approaches and how these challenges were tried to be solved. We will take a look at the eDelivery discovery model and how it's done in PEPPOL. Consequences for the users, the buyers and the sellers. We will look also at the scalability of the infrastructure, a bit about technical specifications, and then we have question and answers. So let's start. Looking back in the old days, and also perhaps as it works currently in some cases, we have setups which are bilaterally agreed between the buyers and sellers, and the configurations of format, the protocols, the endpoints, security is done, that is configured on a peer-to-peer basis. These are often in-house IT solutions involved, and each connection becomes a project. So this is, of course, not very scalable, and we have seen lots of projects like this starting out well and then going into a wall where the onboarding of new suppliers just becomes too cumbersome and expensive. One way to solve these issues with all these connections have been to introduce like a central hub or a three-corner model, which is sometimes referred to. So a central hub takes care of the routings and the configurations. So the sellers and the buyer, they can just connect to one central place. This can seem as a good solution. It looks simple. Problem is, of course, that the buyers and the sellers somehow have to be customers or have a business relationship with this central hub. And of course, the buyer and seller must use the same hub. And over time, as a seller, as a private company, perhaps you will be addressed by your customers and referred to many different of these hubs. And this is often raised as an issue with the three-corner model, that you as a seller, and often a small seller perhaps, need to adapt to many different of these hubs. So this is a fairly common architecture of interconnection between buyers and seller and trading partners. We can also see this in some countries as a government-owned or government-maintained central hub, which everybody connects to. But there are similar challenges with this, as a seller may be a supplier, may supply goods and services to not only within one country. So another approach on addressing some of these issues is to what we call the four-corner model, where the buyer and the seller, they choose a service provider who acts on their behalf. So this means that as the seller, you provide your service provider with information about your buyer, which service provider he is using, and they can set up connections. This has some benefits. Of course, it means that you can choose the service provider that you prefer, so you don't have to connect to everybody yourself. On the other hand, it's also important that these service providers have collaborations agreements between themselves to decide on things like service level agreements, support channels, what protocols to use, and all sorts of things. That means that if you're going cross-border, you will have major problems because your service provider is probably not connected or have agreements with the buyer's service provider in another country. So we have seen issues with this, primarily in the connectivity between the service providers. So typical problems that we see is that it is often a complex process to connect to new business partners. And these connections that you create are costly to configure. It's hard to know which format and standard used for eInvoicing in this scenario, depending on who the receiver is. And going cross-border is often almost impossible in a rational way. Of course, there is always technical ways of overcome this, but it tends to be costly and complex. And one problem is, of course, that all service providers, they don't collaborate. Another consequence is that it becomes very costly to change your service provider, because all of these connections that you have configured and set up, these have to be migrated to a new service provider, and you often have to go through the same process again. I'm not saying that what the issues that I showed you now, the last few slides, are, in all cases. There are examples of service providers who have solved this in nice ways, and there are ways around it, but it's not uncommon that we see these issues that I presented. So looking at how we have tried over time before to solve these issues without much success is, for example, that one of the main issues is that the buyer and the seller, they have to provide information to the service providers on how to interconnect. So where is my buyer? Where is the buyer located? Which format should be used when sending to this buyer, for example? So it has required the issuer, the seller, to provide all the information to his service provider so that the service provider can set up a connection. Ways of solving that is to create a list of receivers, like a database of all the receivers behind the service providers. But that has led to single point of failures, also that the information gets old or incomplete. And there are also commercial trust issues when you're using the same database as the address book. Because many of the issues that we are looking at now are the connectivity between the endpoints, the buyer and the sellers, and how to discover the inbox location, let's say, the endpoint, and which format the receiver is using. And these were well-known problems. There were attempts to solve them with more or less success in different countries. The PEPPOL project tried to address many of these, and one of the big things or innovations that is now part of the CEF eDelivery is the use of dynamic discovery. So we talk about two types of discovery models. So when a buyer and a seller is going to interconnect and exchange messages, they can either use a static discovery model or a static addressing, meaning that the service providers or their access point configure everything beforehand. So it's a static configuration. So they make a routing, they define a routing in their services, and that is then used for all exchange. A dynamic discovery model is instead that each time you send a message, you make a lookup into the network and into the addressing mechanism to figure out which inbox is the receiver using, or which endpoint is using, and which format does he support. And based on that information, I can then dynamically configure my software to send the message. And you do this all the time for each message. And for this dynamic discovery to work, we introduced a few new concepts. We have something called the access points. We have something called service metadata publishers, and something called SML, service metadata locator. And I will describe how this works in the upcoming slides. We also see on the screen that we have, we can say, 4 corners. The participant, the seller, we call him the corner 1, and we have an access point provider, or a service provider. It's corner 2. We have a corner 3, which is also an access point provider, and corner 4, the participant, which is the buyer. These 4 corners, the corner 1 corner 2 is working on corner 1's behalf, and corner 3 is working on Cone4's behalf. So the seller has chosen his access point and the buyer has chosen his access point. The concepts SMP and SML, these are the addressing, the lookup mechanisms, and we will go into detail of how this works in a moment. The thing when we have dynamic addressing is that you will be able to send messages to business partners that you previously have not configured a connection to before. So it's done dynamically. That means that a new access point in the network will be able to receive documents for his receivers without any bilateral agreement or discussions between the access points. That means also that they have to trust each other. So how do I make sure that that I'm sending to a certified or a valid access point? And there are different ways of doing this, but the way it's done in PEPPOL is that they have a set of transport infrastructure agreements. And the idea is that you have the open PEPPOL as the central body, and then you have the PEPPOL authorities. In many of the European countries, we now have PEPPOL authorities, and the service providers are signing an infrastructure agreement with the PEPPOL authority. And that means that as soon as you sign that, you get a digital certificate which you can use in your access point, and by that you can also technically trust that any other service provider who also has a certificate has also signed these agreements. The agreements contains service levels. They describe some of the requirements on the access point provider, and yeah, a lot of aspects necessary, like contact points and things like that. So going back now to the four-corner model, all the service providers or the access point providers, they trust each other through this infrastructure agreement setup. So let's see now what happens when the buyer, let's say that the Cone4 here, the buyer is new to the network. He wants to receive e-invoices. He has procured or he has gotten himself an access point, perhaps through his ERP system or some other external service who provides access point services. So he says, please, can you register me as a receiver in the network? He asks this to the access point, and the access point says, okay. An administrator starts with submitting the details on the buyer's preferences, like what invoicing format does he support, which is the technical address where the invoice should be sent. That is the access point's endpoint. So that is the first step. So he put that in an SMP. So that means that the buyer is now registered in an SMP, that he can receive invoices in a specific access point. But that's not enough. There can be many SMPs in the network. So how would a seller know which SMP to find his business partner in? It's like telephone books. You need to know which telephone book to start looking at. And in this case, in the CEF eDelivery infrastructure, the SMP registers, he creates a record in something called the service metadata locator. So the participant is registered in the SML. That means that there is a central piece of information. The SML is hosted and run by the European Commission. So in here there is a central record that a specific participant, the buyer, is located in a specific SMP. So you can find the register that way. And the SMP is updating the DNS system. So now we have created a possibility to use a simple URL or a REST call to find the way to the correct SMP. I will give you an example of this in a minute. So let's now say that the last slide, we ended up with the buyer being registered in the network in a specific SMP, and there was a record saying that this buyer is in a specific SMP. So now the seller is about to send an invoice. So he issues an invoice and provides it to his access point. The access point takes a look at the invoice, perhaps in the envelope or the ID of the invoice receiver, and he makes a lookup into the DNS based on the participant identifier, the buyer's ID. So he creates, a bit simplified, he creates a URL containing the participant ID. And by creating this URL, he will be directed by the DNS directly to the correct SMP. So with a simple HTTP GET, with a simple get from on a web resource, the access point will receive metadata about the access point, about the buyer's capabilities. An example of what he receives could look like this. This is an actual example of a discovery lookup in the network, and it's a piece of XML. You will see here the participant's identifier. That's the buyer ID. You can see what the supported message type. It's a technical identifier, but it can be, there's a code list, so you can figure out which document type this is. In this case, it's a PEPPOL invoice. You have the process, business process being used, which transport protocol is currently AS2 in PEPPOL. CEF eDelivery is using AS4, and PEPPOL is working in a migration towards AS4. The endpoint reference here is the actual technical URL address for where to post the invoice. So this is the service metadata, which the access point gets back from the service metadata publisher. And based on those parameters, he can send the message to the receiving access point and also get an acknowledgement back. The submission and the acknowledgements are signed with the certificates that the access points received when they signed the PEPPOL agreements, so they can trust that they are connected to certified access points. The last step, of course, is that the access point hands the invoice over to the buyer, for where the buyer then processes the invoice. So all of this transmission is a few steps, but it's dynamically configured, and the seller does not necessarily know, or his service provider, any technical details about the buyer and his service provider beforehand. It's done dynamically. So that's the beauty of this discovery lookup mechanism. Going forward, this has some consequences for the users. If you registered as a receiver in the network, you will eventually, hopefully, receive invoices through the network, and the access point cannot refuse to receive documents. If the sender is a certified access point, the receiving access point must receive the invoice. That means that the buyer must implement some sort of business process or routine to figure out if the invoice is a valid invoice, if it's a known supplier, and if it's going to be accepted or not. Sometimes, if you look how it's been done in other areas, you have a more technical configuration, meaning that all the IDs and the participant IDs need to be configured beforehand, and that means that you is technically unable to send unless you have already beforehand agreed and configured your connection. Here, since it's a dynamic lookup, you will receive documents, but you have to handle them in your business process. This is often something that is seen as a benefit, particularly when you're trying to gain mass adoption of e-invoicing, even 100% of your invoices electronically. You can't have these as technical configurations for all your business partners. That just takes too much time. You want to handle this process as part of your internal routines. So, but this is an important aspect, that if you publish your inbox for invoices in the SMP, you may also receive invoices from suppliers which you weren't expecting an electronic invoice from. If you're familiar with paper invoicing, this is how it's often worked there too. You can expect invoices from essentially anybody, but you have to have a business process to make sure that it's a valid purchase and it's a valid supplier. So that means that if it's an unknown supplier, you need to put it up in a to-do list in your workflow somehow. But these are important aspects of these types of network. So I'm now handing over to Christian on the scalability of the infrastructure.
Yes.
And I thank you. I see that some questions have been put into the chat. I'll go through them and we'll answer them in the end of the webinar. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Martin. So when Martin is describing this, you hear a lot about CEF eDelivery and you hear a lot about PEPPOL. And as we talked about in one of the previous webinars, it's also important that that you realize that what is the history behind this, because in the beginning of prior to the eInvoicing, CEF eInvoicing, before that was created, we had the PEPPOL project, and the PEPPOL project ended in August 2012. When the project ended, it was clear that we had a few hundred receivers capable of receiving electronic invoices through the PEPPOL infrastructure. Martin, could you please also transfer the controls to me? Thank you. But what has happened since then? Because if we take a look at the actual scalability of the solution, PEPPOL infrastructural components is not necessarily fully equal to the CEF eDelivery components.
Christian, did you receive the?
No.
Sorry.
Oh,
okay. No. Sorry about that.
Thank you. No problem. So, as you can see here with the brand new numbers at the bottom of the screen, we have widely exceeded the numbers that was in 2012. Naturally, these numbers is just a rough estimate, because this is the ones that we know that are registered. It doesn't really say anything about how many transactions, but we know that it is rather millions and thousands. But point is, since we are using the dynamic lookup, especially within e-invoicing and e-procurement, the solution is very, very scalable compared to a static lookup model. And this also means that although that the components can exist and be used in different contexts and in different domains, one size does not necessarily fit everybody. So, for instance, here you'll see an overview of how different components of CEF eDelivery fits in different contexts. So you have, for instance, the e-procurement, the PEPPOL domain in the left-hand column, and then you have the e-justice domain from the e-codex project in the middle column. But in fact, you could also choose to have your different implementations on various components which fits you. Naturally, now that we're speaking about e-invoicing, it would be over in the lines of Open PEPPOL, and they are, as mentioned by Martin, migrating towards AS4. But nevertheless, time has shown us that the solution is highly scalable and fitted for purpose, and production data is well kept and secured in the network. The CEF eDelivery specifications. Well, first of all, we try to promote the use of existing specifications and standards rather than define new ones, which means that by having the profiling work of eSense and PEPPOL on these standards, we actually take on what was already delivered through the project and take it into a further context with new domains and new settings. We offer these as an open source implementations that can be used, but also there are a number of commercial software and service providers who are offering their components to a wider audience. I'll come back to that. The different components you can see here that we are using with the access point is the eSense AS4 profile, as well as the PEPPOL AS2 profiles. We also use ETI electronic signature infrastructure profiles for digital certificates, and ETI REM for the evidence, meaning the evidence emitter, yeah. So, and as Martin was mentioning, for the SML, we're using eSense profile as well as the SMP as well. Here you will see an overview of the different AS4 conformance solutions. Many of these was part of the eSense project, but we can also see a higher and higher interest in getting new service providers on board and testing with our different tools and components. So you will be able to go into CEF Digital again, as previously mentioned, and also find contact details for all these solution providers that can assist you. Naturally, we still have our open solution, but all these are also free to engage and can be used in different implementations. We also have a list of certified PEPPOL access point providers. That list is located on OpenPEPPOL's webpage, peppol.eu. Here you'll find a very long list of nearly 200 access point providers that has been tested, verified, and certified by OpenPEPPOL. So that's also an option for you. All in all, what we can see in the lessons learned here is that automated and dynamic lookup and discovery is necessary for the mass use of electronic businesses. We do acknowledge that you need to have a common collaboration agreement and security structure in order for us to fully be accomplished with the legal frameworks in Europe for e-procurement and e-invoicing. But we can see that through the works of the PEPPOL project as well as the eSense project, this is in place now, and it's in production in the member states. Basically, we have when you're using the infrastructure as is, you should acknowledge that there are no direct roaming fees or discriminations of the participants that are using it. It depends on the service level agreements between the service providers and the solution providers and their customers, if any fees are applicable. This means that on the infrastructure that the Commission is offering, and also the PEPPOL network, you are not entitled to pay any fees there, but there might be some fees connected to the different agreements in the outer corners of the model that was shown by Martin before. Everything that we're doing here is based on standardized specifications. This also means that we're working closely together with the different standardization organs that take on the different work components that we're using. And it's important also to realize that the work is not ending here. We are continuing the development of the components, especially, for instance, around evidence emitters and security and trusts, such as eID. And this is something that we're going to take on in the future. Some of the key focuses so far has, of course, been business to government transactions, and business to business has been a natural offspring of that. But also in the future, we foresee that business to consumers will be in the scope of e-invoicing and our components. So I think we are walking towards a very interesting future indeed. That was it for the introductory part. I will continue here and just briefly mention that we have an open call for e-invoicing right now. And why am I mentioning this? Well, I'm mentioning because when we're looking at the funding and grants, this is a possibility for you to apply for funding if you're having a proposal or project that you want to complete in either your member state or between private entities. The call for grants and proposals opened on the 20th of June, and it closes on the 28th of November. And for e-invoicing, we have a indicative budget of 10 million euros. Last year it was 7 million euros, and it ended up at 10.4 million euros. So it might be that it will be higher. What we do know is that this year's call is the largest of them all. This is the third call in a row. Next year's call will be less budget, so this means that it's even more important for you to apply here. So the important part here is that e-invoicing alone is okay to apply for that, but in most cases you would need the components of CEF eDelivery as well to create interoperability and create connections between your solutions as well as other solutions in Europe or the partners in your consortium. So it's up to you to define what is the right scoping and try to tailor your proposals as such. But we took these slides in because we think it's important for you to understand that there is a possibility to get funding for e-invoicing projects, but it actually also includes CEF eDelivery components as a possibility. So who can apply? Well, for the consortium and the composition of the consortium, you need at least 2 private or public entities from one or several member states. You will be able to get co-financing of up to 75% of the eligible cost plus overhead. The indicative duration of the project will be 12 months, and rare occasions we have seen a bit longer, but not much. Currently, there is a number of ongoing projects being initiated and a number of projects being executed and finalized within the past e-invoicing calls. So we hope to see a lot of you participating in there as well, and also broaden out the usage of our CEF eDelivery components. When you're writing your proposals, you have to meet one of these 2 objectives here. Either to have an uptake of the e-invoicing solution comply with the European norm and its auxiliary deliverables by the public entities, or you could take it from the other side of the table, update of the e-invoicing solutions compliant to the European norm and the auxiliary deliverables by solution providers and public authorities. This means that we do have also not a sub-criteria, but a common understanding that deployment of eDelivery building blocks or use of eDelivery through service providers could be used in either objectives 1 or 2. So there's no discrimination in towards one of the objectives in relation to CEF eDelivery, so that's important. If you're interested in applying for this funding, you can find more information here on our sister agency, INEA. And there are also some different options of calling in as well as writing them. And they also have a support desk that you can contact if you have interest in this.